Here at the Independence Reformed Bible Church, we do allow for questions following the sermon. Who has the first question?
I have been to many churches over the years, and I think the doctrine tends to be divisive. And
Like all doctrine or just some doctrine?
well, there's essential doctrine and there's non-essential doctrine, and it's
Okay.
the non-essential doctrine that tends to be divisive. The essential
Okay.
stuff is like the virgin birth, the resurrection,
Yeah.
things you
Yeah.
have to believe in order to be a
Right.
Christian.
Yeah, maybe things like in the creeds, for example. Yeah.
There's just stuff, so when you talk about this reconstruction, um, I'm not really 100% clear on this stuff yet as to what you're preaching in that regard. I don't think Jesus has come back bodily yet. So I look at doctrine as, okay, how does it affect what we're doing? Like the pre-trib people, they think, oh, well, hey, I'm going to escape all this stuff. I'm going to be out of here, so why bother? Why do any of this and just, go along to get along? Well, that's totally wrong. And that's because look at what it does to their behavior. Okay, so I like that you're saying God is providential. I absolutely believe that. And he is alive in the Holy Spirit here with us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just think that it's just divisive sometimes, and we ought to concentrate on what unites us and brings us together. And I don't know where I'm just having some issues with, what is going to make us do what we're supposed to be doing? What is going to keep us on track, on our mission, on our, and is it thinking that we've got to do this work, or is it, I just need a little clarity on that, I think.
Sure.
Thanks.
I guess that touches the sermon this morning briefly, Marilyn. But I'll say this: one of the most challenging things I ever heard was when I heard someone say that God does not expect us necessarily to change the world. He does expect us to be faithful. And I've said to some friends of mine, am I happy with that? You see, when I get to heaven, I want to hear, "Well done, thou world-changing, white horse riding knight of righteousness that destroyed the wicked, left their bodies on the field," and so forth. But actually not said, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Where and you can see, of course, you've read, I'm sure, our IRBC vision there. It's in the bulletin there this morning. There's always this tension, shall we say, that I've noticed between what am I supposed to do and what effect does that have? And for some, and I go back to this illustration a lot because it's a good one. The mocking, let's say, of the protester at an abortion clinic. What good is that person doing? Just they're there. All they're doing is making a fool of themselves or whatever. But that's not it. What is it is that are they obeying Christ by being out there or not, which is really the only question. Now it's hard to separate that. I find it's hard to separate that from, wait a minute, what good are you actually doing? But the first good always has to be, are we being faithful to Christ? Yeah, that's the first good. And I know I do, this is a broken record with me, but I constantly go back to those Old Testament prophets that Christ had such good things to say about. As we said before, he had some pretty bad things to say about the priests, the Levites, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. But when it came to prophets, he always had good stuff to say about them. And as a group, for the most part, they didn't really see, for the most part, the value of their input. Some did. Elijah had a good day there on Mount Carmel, the prophets of Baal. That was a good day at the office. But that's really exceptional. Most of the prophets we just don't see. In fact, Isaiah was basically told he's not going to see any results. He's going to minister, and it's all going to be a failure. So we have perhaps, this is just a small thing, we have perhaps two different definitions of success, if you will. And our first definition of success always has to be, are we actually being faithful to Christ, where we are. And most of the time, our faithfulness to Christ is anything but glamorous. It's the opposite of the world beater that I want to be. And maybe perhaps some others do. In the end, I guess I love those Old Testament prophets so much, not as much as I should, but I love them so much because they just really, the praises of the world and even the praises of the people that should have been in their corner, the very people that should have been supporting them, just meant nothing to them. What mattered to them was the fear of the Lord and not that much else. I'll wrap this up with a quote from Martin Luther that I read one time. And Luther, who was a man of great courage, made a comment. He said, if I really feared God and had faith, if I really, really did, he said, two things would happen. I'd be able to chase the Turk from Constantinople and the Pope from Rome. And this is a man who had great courage, but he recognized that in the end he was just kind of scared like everybody else. That's a scary thing, I know, for me. Really, really scary. Because the Bible is just, I heard an excellent presentation this week on fear as a motivator. And the speaker who was talking about was saying, that the one thing we're told, command again and again, is fear not. And yet what is the one thing that we just have it out there all the time, is fear. What I would argue that would really pull us together is if we could really grow, if our fear of God would grow, if our fear of man would shrink. Easier said than done. Fair question, though. Who else has a question? Yes.
I was just struck being in Albania, which was 50 years of communism, and then they tore down every church, well, almost every church,
Yeah.
practically every church. And why, if Christianity isn't really true, if Christ isn't really the king, then leave them up, right? So,
Yeah.
But they didn't. And I just was struck by that in your sermon that in the end they will fear God, and that's why they do these things, because they understand the power of God, even though they're trying to control their world and have power and all those things. If God's really not real, then why take him down?
Yeah.
So anyway, I was just struck by your comment.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Did the ones that they left standing there in Albania, did they turn them like into a museum? What? Okay. There. Yeah, what is it? Yeah, I'd like to hear about this.
We did go to a church a couple times. It was in Albanian, and it was a little difficult. We had kind of an interpreter,
Yeah.
but you could see Christ, and you could see the power of Christ, and you can see the joy of Christ and the Holy Spirit moving, and that was very encouraging. So, despite 50 years of oppression, and it's been 20 years since communism fell, but God's still on the move, and He's always going to be on the move. So.
Thank you. That is an amazing thing. I mean, I was born in 1957, so I became, shall we say, conscious during like Khrushchev, for example. And when I was in my teens and so forth, communism looked like an unstoppable juggernaut. And there's still plenty of it around. And the effects of it are still ruining people's lives. No doubt about it. Look at the options you did not have in Albania because of communism for all these years. But ultimately, it's not about communal living. It's about who gets to be God, which is always the issue. And to your point, you got to tear down those churches because they're a reminder of they're not God. So get rid of them. Good stuff. Yes.
In Psalm 48 talks quite a bit about Zion, and you touched on this from Hebrews 12, 22, and 23.
Yes.
But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the general assembly in the church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. In your opinion, does that passage in Hebrews equate the church with Zion? When we read Zion in the Old Testament, should we generally speaking read church?
Especially when it talks about God's dwelling place, where he actually lives. Of course, we know that he lived with his people there in the wilderness, pillar of cloud, pillar of fire. He dwelled with his people. Interestingly enough, and the answer to that is yes, because especially when he's talking about where he lives, where he dwells, which is what that's talking about. Interestingly enough, that topic came up in in Stephen's sermon there in Acts. Because you may recall that the charge against Stephen just before he got stoned to death was that he was attacking the temple, this holy place. And his defense was that God doesn't dwell in this place. He always dwells in the hearts of his people. And of course there, and he quotes the Old Testament saying, where is the house? Do you think you're going to build me a house? You know, I live in all here. I'm everywhere. What kind of house do you think you're going to build for me? So the answer is we can't build him a house. He lives within his people, and the people that this has been a classic, if you will, belief in Christian circles, partly demonstrated by the song I quoted. Glorious things of thee are spoken, Zion city of our God, thee whose word cannot be broken, formed thee for his own abode. He's talking about his people. He's not talking about a bricks and mortar here. Follow up with that, or? Okay, all right. Yes.
You mentioned that either the righteous are afraid of the wicked or the wicked are afraid of the righteous. And just thinking about in our families, if we feel like, sometimes we feel like, Satan or, can be coming into our family. I mean, he could be attacking us, in different ways. In that way, we may be, a righteous family could then be afraid of the wicked in that way. But instead of fearing, we should give Satan cause to fear. So,
Amen.
Practically speaking, in the family, what are some ways that we could, give Satan cause to fear, on a practical level?
Yeah. Okay. If you heard that, the question is, how can the enemy of our souls fear our families? I find it just absolutely intriguing that the covenant blessing, the whole plan of God for 3 generations was just being held within a family. Not a huge organization, but a family. Abraham, the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in some cases, in every single case, interestingly enough, they couldn't have children. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and in the case of Jacob, and certainly Rachel, we had an infertility problem in each one of those cases, and yet the covenant blessings of God was held within, that's where it was being passed on, within that family with all of its problems. Now, of course, we're told today the family's not good enough, it doesn't work. But to answer to address that question, it is very difficult for me. I'm somewhat of a fan of missionary biographies. and haven't read as much as I'd like. But when you read about missionary biographies, again and again, their first impressions, they're growing up, their ideas of the world, and the things that had to be done didn't come from a textbook. It often came from their fathers. If you ever get a chance to read about the missionary John Peyton who went to the New Hebrides, anybody here familiar with him? John Peyton? P-A-T-O-N. There's a stirring, you need to read it. A stirring talk about when he was going off, and his father knew he would never see him again. And his thoughts about what his father had taught him, and all the love he had towards his father, and what his father had made him, quote unquote. In my case, my father has tremendous influence on me. It's no mistake that children are seen as arrows in Psalms. And what are arrows? We have our own personal equipment, right? Ephesians 6, helmet of salvation, sword of the Spirit, shield of faith, right? That's for in close fighting, right? Helmets, swords, shields, my sword is only good for someone right in front of me, right? It's not good for the enemy in the next generation. But you know what's good for the enemy in the next generation? Arrows. That's for an enemy that's far off. I believe, and I said this again this morning, talk about this latest baby that's been born. He's not over there. Is he gone? Carried him off. Okay. Anytime there's a baby born into a godly family or brought into a godly family, however way it gets there, the enemy of our souls does not know what he's dealing with. He just doesn't know. Doesn't know if he's going to grow up to bring great damage to his kingdom. And so while it feels like coming home day and I interact with my children, you will know, all you parents understand this, the day will come when your children will go out and they will fight battles that you can't fight because you're not them. And they're out there fighting those battles. And I honestly believe, I believe this with all my heart, that the enemy of our souls fears a godly family a lot more than he fears an evangelistic crusade. If you, or when you, teach your children, model God's goodness, God's mercy, His grace, His providence, I honestly believe with all my heart that is when the enemy of our souls fears that Christian family the most. Remember, Satan tried to kill the child. That's when he struck. We don't really see him coming back until the Garden of Gethsemane, if you will. Well, you see him in the temptation, of course. But that was years and years later. Am I saying changing diapers and reading and playing with your children? Am I really saying the enemy of our souls fears that? Oh yeah. Yeah, he'd much rather have you apart. He'd much rather have no influence from the father to the children. That's what he would have, because he knows that if he can get that done, the rest is just mop up, right? Rest is mop up. Remember, end of Malachi, turn the hearts of the fathers to the children. Not the parents, the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to the fathers. That's what the Messiah is going to do. I find that an amazing statement at the end of Malachi about what the Messiah is going to do. What a statement. Turn the hearts of fathers to children, children to fathers. Yeah. Yeah. Because at that point, the enemy of our souls has something really to worry about, because now he's got a long-term problem. I know it's not glamorous. Well, I want to thank you for your kind attention here this morning.